back to MFA Writers. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. I know this is a stressful time with the start of the new semester, MFA decisions rolling in, and everything else in the world today that I don't need to mention here. So we at the pod just wanted to take a minute to let you all know that we're thinking of you, all of you, wherever you're listening from. If you're going through it right now, keep your head up, keep moving forward, and keep writing. We love you all. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/mfawriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Derek Chan, a writer and educator from Melbourne, Australia. He holds a first-class honors in literary studies from Monash University, where he received the Arthur Brown Thesis Prize. His writing has appeared in journals and anthologies such as Best of Australian Poems, Australian Poetry Anthology, Cordite Poetry Review, Meanjin, The Margins, Juked, and elsewhere. He's been a finalist for awards by Frontier Poetry and Palette Poetry, and he is currently an MFA candidate at Cornell University, where he is an editorial associate for the literary magazine Epic and a university fellow. Today, Derek has brought 2 poems to read for us.
Thank you so much for having me on. The first poem I'm going to read is called Bed of Winter. It just references a flower known as the meihua, which translates to plum blossom. Bed of Winter. Pawpaw dreams of glaucoma moon, a white meihua flowering across alluvial night. She dreams each strand of light, a stemmed grief, stirring the parable of her face. Dreams each eye unhinging, like swollen figs, as the wok dark smoulders her deeper into the fever of steamed fish, into the incorporeal salt of ever-dissolving dreams, where some nights she awakens, nestled in the strange grasses of a half-parted world, seeding the soil with her astonishment, as she slow dances amongst schizandra leaves, as she skips stones like unhoarded decades, as she calls out to her grandchildren gathered on distant plains, the feathery heads aglow, like meihuas thawing into impossible morning, and sometimes there grows a silence which glistens like apples, the music box of nectar she cleaves open to feel the aching fermata of her hollowed gums, and sometimes she watches meihua sun blossom brutal black beneath the reddening sprig of dusk, and she understands the sea's greyness to be a mirror without the home of its reflection, and all through alluvial night she digs out the compass of the horizon to etch divinations into the cicatrix of stars, to omen herself into sky, before geographies of sight harden into cataracts of maps, before the slow trains of sleep bear her back through the dark weed of dreams, into the shimmering station of this snow-rocked room, of this world she could never part with, where the blanket sculpt her bedlam body into the impermanence of summer frost, and the pale plosives of her breath unpetal over her a white meihua morning, something unspeakably soft. And the second poem I'm going to read is titled Immigration Interview, Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. Who paid for your passage? The blood that burned the brightest was always the one we followed. Is there a clock in your father's bedroom? While he slept, silver wheat grew from the sweat of his clothes. The morning found a quiet place to kneel. Is someone forcing you to come here? I don't understand the question. Who were your neighbors? The name Yu Yan, the name Ying Yue, the clouds sliding like Wang Shu's wet slippers across the hallway. The field inside the finger, the golden doorknobs wrapped in a blanket, the loose joints rattling the ginger jar, the salt in the curve of a pinne, the sound womb glistening the air, the strand of hair lengthening in the spine of a book, the ocean forgetting our names, the sky thirsting for our bodies thirsting for the sky, the country, her country, welling in the afterglow. Who paid for your passage? Unable to speak, the dark thawed around us. We held birds like candles. A child mistook the snow for his mother. What direction does the front of your house face? When we were lost, I pulled the curve of moonlight from the wet of his lips into a sickle between my palms. It always spun south. What pieces of furniture were in your living room? The radio, the father inside the radio, the box of chalk, the pocket mirror, the teeth, the jade inside the teeth, the map that shrivels in the moonlight, the wax that blooms in the bone, the chopsticks slid into the holes of coins, the shadows braided on the clothesline, the window that breaks like an eardrum, the wind drawing names in the ashtray, the bayberry bleeding on the tongue, the body thrashing like a blanket in the mouth, the candied ginger goldening on the table, the breasts, her breasts, swelling ripe in the heat. What is your final destination? Could you please repeat the question? What is your final destination? Where the shadow pauses at the edge of a meadow into the shape of a deer. What is your name? What is your name?
Derek, that was great. Thanks for sharing those poems with us, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. So, as listeners will notice from the second poem you read, you sometimes write about Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution, and immigration, things that are not just a curiosity for you, but something that your parents lived through. So, tell us about your mom and dad, their experience, and how that has affected the subject matter of your writing.
Yeah, sure. So I would say it actually really kind of dates back to my grandparents, I would say, who really lived through the bulk of it. So I guess on my father's side, their family left a bit earlier before the things like really kind of set in. So on my mother's side, I think I would say that it had a bit more of a kind of difficult kind of journey. My grandmother, she was kind of, living through that period where there was like kind of the famine setting in, property being seized. And interestingly enough, during that time, she became one of her village's kind of a leader, I guess. And because of that, my understanding is that she had quite a lot of influence, and she leveraged that influence to kind of get she had around I think 3 children at that time, and she leveraged that influence to kind of get them across out of China and into Hong Kong. And which is quite remarkable because she was doing it by herself at that time as well, because later on her husband had to do it in a kind of separate, more roundabout way, where he had to actually get on one of those boats in the middle of the night and kind of cross the strait over into the harbor. And that was obviously a very dangerous journey at that time, because I remember my dad would tell me it wouldn't be uncommon to kind of wake up and kind of see bodies washing up on the shore from kind of failed kind of expedition. So and it was in Hong Kong that my parents were born and raised. My mom's side, was quite in a bad kind of socioeconomic state, pretty much for most of her life. They had a lot of, she had a lot of siblings at that time, and what made it difficult was also the fact that her father passed away when she was quite young. So it was really just my grandma who was just kind of really powerful figure who was just kind of supporting 8 children in one go. And so I guess because of that, it kind of made more sense for my mother and her siblings kind of go straight into work as soon as possible. And so she did a lot of like odd jobs. Like growing up, she would kind of work in like garbage disposal, or she would kind of be in factories, kind of I know. I remember she told me something about like putting together like plastic flowers in a factory. Later on, like she did quite well for herself. Like she ended up working in like a first class lounge for like Cathay Pacific, and that for her was like really kind of a big deal, because how else was she going to like travel the world and like, experience all this stuff that like would have otherwise been impossible? And so I would say like that's a kind of brief summary of my mother's side. I would say my dad's side ended up having a bit more like favorable kind of outcome. Like his father ended up being quite a good tailor, so he did kind of help make ends meet. And my father, he did actually finish high school and wanted to kind of pursue I think science at that time. At a kind of university level. And that was how he ended up in Australia, because at that time, like the universities there were actually free. And so it kind of made sense to go there. And but kind of like I think some unfortunate things happened, and he ended up kind of being an undocumented citizen for a few years. So that kind of put a halt to his studies, and he ended up just having to like kind of do odd jobs, kind of survive. And it was essentially my mum. She had a flight into Australia at some point, and apparently my dad's side of the family and my mother's side of the family have some kind of ties going back, and so we're just like, oh, since you're both in Australia, you should both kind of meet and kind of see what happens. And that's how I was Australian.
Well, you mentioned like the difficulties that so many people had immigrating from China during that time, like your grandparents' time. I'm curious if hearing those stories about like seeing bodies in the water, that kind of thing, if that influences you at all to become a storyteller, to try to tell some of those stories.
Yeah, that's a question I've always been thinking about, because it's a really difficult one. Because on the one hand, those things have happened, you hear about them, and those stories, I guess, in many ways have kind of shaped you as a person. But also because of those events, I'm physically, not in China or not in Hong Kong. Right. I'm here. So there's a very like clearly kind of like material way in which those stories have affected me. But there's also a really like strong awareness that there's still such a kind of great distance between what I've heard and what I really know. And whether or not I can really carry any story at all sometimes is what I think to myself. Like, because those things have happened, they've kind of gone. I'm sitting in the aftermath that seems to have kind of affected me in some way. But also it's like, I don't know all the details. I can't communicate it with my grandparents. And so, I know, I think of like what one of my supervisors, Virginia, said, which was like, if I speak to the dead, ultimately, am I just speaking like to myself? Like, who am I really speaking to? And I think Kim Hae-sun, who wrote Autobiography of Death, said like, writing a poem is like, being a tomb robber that's robbing my own grave. And like, I feel that kind of sense of like the excavation of storytelling that I'm doing is kind of just like, it feels like in some sense it's just kind of like really about myself.
Yeah, sure.
I do believe that there is something that is happening, and maybe it's because like I think of history and stories kind of like, being only existing as a kind of like collective kind of consciousness. And so in that sense, history is very like malleable. And maybe what I do when I write a poem isn't so much as like trying to say that, I've preserved or kind of extracted some history. Maybe it's more to do with like, I'm using the malleable nature of history kind of like cast a ripple, and to kind of show that the past is as divergent as the future, and trying to find some kind of some sense of like, I know, emotional truth, or some sense of thinking about history that can be kind of particularized through my specific experience.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like it really always comes back to empathy, right? I mean, like, you can't directly tell the stories of those people who went through that experience because you didn't go through that experience, but your life has been influenced by them. And through writing, it's like an opportunity to kind of understand what those people went through and empathize with what they went through, and be grateful for it, right?
Yeah, I do think that. And something that was really interesting that I spoke to like Aishin Hutchinson about was, the fact that, a poet takes something objective and makes it subjective. A historian might take something subjective and try and offer it as objective. And that's a very like, I think it's like, obviously, that can be contested, but there's some like interesting kernel of truth in that, like the sense of like when I write a poem, when there's an interesting image, an interesting like voice that I feel, it feels almost like something outside of history, something outside of myself, that I'm writing a poem that feels like very particularized to a certain time and space, a certain language. But what I'm tapping into often feels like this larger, like peripheral kind of sense. And like if there is a story that's being carried on, it often feels like outside of like what I perceive as my own specific experience. It feels like I'm tapping into something that's maybe like a broader history of how humans have been moving across the world.
So growing up in Australia, you described your relationship to language as a vitally sustaining yet disaffecting experience. You told me that you felt some shame for not knowing English and then later shame for forgetting Cantonese. How do you think this experience has affected your view of and relationship to language?
Oh, it was actually like forgetting Mandarin later on. But yeah, I think like growing up, like language was like obviously very like sustaining, as I said, because like it was a thing that kind of got me, from primary school to uni, because like most of my scholarships, most of my kind of funding came from performing well in English exams and English tests. So, I owe so much to the language. But, I remember like growing up, like being like a bit behind on like my like English acquisition, having like lisping in the schoolyard and kind of people pointing that out, or being kind of taken out middle of the class to like ESL sessions and kind of just like feeling like I was kind of a sore thumb. It's quite strange because like later on, even when I did kind of become like more like well versed in English, like it just becomes a different like marker of difference. Like even like a couple of months ago, I was in New York, like at a poetry reading, and like on that night, like 3 or 4 people came up and were like, "You don't sound like the way you look." Like it was just like a very like bizarre kind of comment, that, even as you kind of progress, like there is no kind of ultimate kind of way of hiding the dissonance of language from who you are.
I mean, do you think that writing, specifically writing poetry, is a way to explore and maybe bridge that dissonance?
What I think is interesting about like writing is like you have the interior, and language is kind of like the closest to materializing that interior into this kind of like found object in front of you that you can kind of like mold. And to me, like poetry kind of offers not just like, being able to see your interior in front of you, which is like very important, because I feel like we don't really know what we think until we see what we think. But also poetry offers like an aesthetic kind of force. I often think of aesthetics as like a force for agency. Like you have the interior in front of you, you have the materials, but aesthetics gives you the shape, gives you the force to shape it, like whether through prosody or form or image. That's where you're able to kind of like contour like your explorations of identity, to kind of push questions, and to even like have things come out and be like, why am I saying this? Like, where's this coming from? I feel like in that sense, like it's offered me a lot.
I mean, I feel like identity is something that's so amorphous and so ingrained, right? That like we act in ways that we don't even realize are being affected by our history and by the way that we were brought up. But something about writing and telling a story, yeah, like you said, it's like a way to, like putting it down on paper is a way to make it physical, to see it, actually give it shape. And to me, like I do a lot of exploring my upbringing in my writing, and I find that I'm able to better understand why I am the way I am once I've like written a story than if I'm just trying to like think about it.
I agree with that, because like thinking is just like one part of yourself. There's the actual like embodiment of the self, like the thinking moving with like the emotion, moving with the body. And I think like poetry to me is kind of like the unity of the being kind of coming together. Like it's not just like your intellect or propositional arguments are working. It's also like there's your emotions are making thoughts, your thoughts are creating emotion. Like it's just kind of like strange kind of like debris of movement. And the poem, I think, kind of records and kind of preserves the living, breathing kind of being through the whole poem. And it's like that's a type of thinking that can't occur in isolation from its parts. It's a very kind of freeing and a very like alive sense of thinking. You know, the poem is like, you know, creating like a new language each time you write it. And it's almost like there's like a sanctuary that comes from having a poem that is a one-to-one relation to itself that can't be reducible, because you're creating images that can't be reduced to anything other than itself. And so like to me it's like it's like standing in like the center of like a hurricane, you know, like where it's like really quiet, but like the chaos is what protects you at the same time. And again, honoring the mystery, the bewilderment is what, you know, prevents the poem from being like performative or from being like tokenizing, because you know, you're not just like, it's not just like you're thinking about a certain subject matter or a certain part of yourself. You're using like the full weight of your being. It's all swirling around this kind of center that is ineffable. And so like it kind of like, yeah, safeguards the poem into a space where like you are like constantly like a multiple. You are constantly kind of being constructed and deconstructed.
Well, let's dig into your writing process and your views on poetry a bit, specifically what you call the inherent and inexhaustible mystery of poetry. What do you think it is about poetry that is so mysterious, and how does this sense of mystery affect your drafting process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like I always start with some level of like unconscious kind of material. So that to me is where like the bewilderment comes from, kind of like placing that at the center of the process. And that could begin with, you know, like associative free writing, or kind of having 3 or 4 different poets I'm reading and kind of like having them in front of me simultaneously until like there's a kind of conversation, a kind of like interstitial kind of movement between those poems. And that kind of shunts me into that associative state to kind of start writing. But I do think that, you know, once you have those like unconscious dark materials kind of coming out, you also do need the kind of conscious kind of rein to kind of just kind of direct it, because there's a degree, I think, of, you know, just also responsibility of, you know, what you're writing about, and not just having it purely kind of like an aesthetic gratification. And so I kind of see it as like, you know, you might be like on a little like tugboat in the middle of like a giant storm, and like the storm is, you know, ultimately where you want to be, that kind of bewilderment, but you exert a bit of agency by just like moving the rudder a little bit. So you're kind of like still navigating a little bit inside the storm. And I feel like it's that meeting of like the unconscious kind of mediated by the conscious mind, as well as that kind of is where the poetry happens for me, that kind of meeting point.
Yeah, I actually have this print above my writing desk of a ship at night kind of lost at sea, like the roiling waters. And like I have it there to remind me when I'm in the drafting process that it is okay to be lost, right? It's okay to just follow the current, if you will, of my writing process. And in fact, I find that being in that state of not knowing is a sign that I'm like on the right track. If I know too much about what I want a story to be about before I start drafting, I find that it comes out quite stale.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Because I think ideas can be very like authoritarian in that regard. Like it's another way, I guess, of, I assume like we can just think about, you know, like communist China, like, you know, when we have ideas that are set in a certain way, when there's binaries, when there's dichotomies, you know, that's where we feel there's a coercive force in the poem. And for a poem to feel like truly free and to be honest and that we trust, it has to be a poem that, you know, sheds all its senses of coercion. And I think the center of that is the bewilderment, where like the person and the ego and the ideas are taken out of the equation.
Well, before we talk about the MFA program at Cornell and its effect on your writing, I want to talk a bit about your path to the MFA. At one point, you had largely abandoned your literary pursuits for the aim of becoming a clinical psychologist. What influenced that move at the time away from writing?
So I think I was trying to, I think through psychology, I was really trying to do the same thing that I was trying to attempting with poetry, but in the kind of opposite way. So I think ultimately I'm very interested in the interior or in the mind, in something, the kind of intangible aspects of being in the world, which I think is the heart of our being in the world. And, with psychology, it kind of has like a kind of bottom-up approach. So we study the matter of the brain, and then we try and extrapolate from that into the kind of phenomenological kind of state of the mind. But there's always that kind of like epistemological gap where it's like you can study everything about the material world, but it still never really crosses over into explaining the subjective experience of the world. And so I feel like at some point that just kind of dried up for me because I just want to situate myself into the heart of the being. And so for me, poetry was kind of like the top-down approach where you were in the like phenomena of being, of experiencing. And from that, I get to situate myself in that center and to write from that place. In many ways, I feel like poetry is kind of also, it also attempts to cross into the material because I feel like poetry is such an embodied process as well. But yeah, as to like that was essentially why I dropped it. But one of the bigger reasons I think that really influenced my shift into poetry was near the end of my undergraduate studies. I did an introductory to poetry class, and I met my mentor there, who was a MFA graduate from Michigan, and he essentially just showed so much like faith and belief in my writing, kind of just made me see myself as a writer. And so he also introduced me to MFA programs, which were just like a really bizarre prospect, to be paid to write poetry. And so I feel like once that happened, I was like, it just kind of like opened something up in me that was like, I had to try this at least once. Otherwise, I think I would always kind of be regretting it.
And so you ended up moving to the States to attend the MFA program at Cornell University, a 2-year fully funded program with tracks in fiction and poetry. Each year, the program accepts only 8 new students, 4 in each concentration. So it's a pretty small program. I lived abroad for several years, and I found that experience to be both difficult and thrilling, sometimes simultaneously. So how are you doing with the transition to the States and Ithaca, New York?
Yeah, it's been kind of interesting. I would say that on the whole, it's been, overall very a pleasant experience. I have had a lot of solitude to write, and because there's pretty much nothing else to do. It's just a kind of very quaint town surrounded by a lot of waterfalls and kind of hiking trails. So in terms of just having peace and quiet to write, it definitely has offered me that. But when I was first in New York City, I was very overwhelmed by the construction, by the aggression, by the constant sirens. So I feel like the city is definitely a different beast altogether. I felt like I had a little bit of kind of an adjustment kind of period. I think part of it was because I was kind of going through things before I came here. So I had been through a breakup just before I left. And that coupled with, in the past, I've had anxiety in the past. And so I feel like a lot of things kind of came together. And so I can't say how much of it is, because of the move here and how much of it is just kind of the natural kind of process. It kind of came to a head in that kind of winter period when everyone's kind of gone from college town. Everyone, because the whole population here is pretty much students. So when everyone's gone, it's so quiet, and I didn't expect that. So that was another kind of period of isolation that really kind of made me have to do more tussle with my emotions a bit more. So now I'm definitely once I got past the first semester, now I'm in a much better state. I guess another thing though that did kind of occur to me more recently was just being more aware of the gun violence as well. I had heard about it obviously my whole life in the media, but being here and then actually like having a situation where like a couple of weeks ago, like I was walking past the street and then like 30 minutes or something, an hour later, I came back and it was like all like cordoned off because like there was like a drive-by or something. And
Wow.
I think that's very rare, like in Ithaca, but like the fact that I was like in proximity to it was like very like unsettling. So I think that was another thing, just like really realizing, oh, this is real.
As I mentioned, Cornell has a small MFA program. So how has the size of that program made community building more or less difficult for you?
I would say that I have enjoyed the small kind of environment overall. There's really just like a lot of chances to kind of connect, whether it's like, get-togethers or like going out for dinner. So I feel like on one hand, it really helps bring people together. I guess on the other hand, I do think, having a larger cohort could also be useful sometimes, I think, because like having more personalities around can often be just like a useful kind of thing to jolt your own thinking. But yeah, I haven't really had much problem like settling in here and making friends. But I would still kind of advise, still making effort, because it's easy to become complacent and think that because it's small, you can kind of drift by and automatically kind of click with people. But I feel like, I still, in the first few months, I would kind of make more of a concerted effort to reach out, because especially in places like here where it is a bit more isolated, that you really want to try and like get your best foot forward when you can, to just kind of start building networks before like you end up somewhere in the winter where you're like, feeling very alone. So like it's good to like set that up early.
Right. Well, I think that's good advice for anybody considering an MFA program or graduate school in general. Specifically for international students, do you have any advice for anyone who's considering moving to the States and doing an MFA program?
I think like having certain kind of safeguards like kind of put in place early on. So like, for instance, I wish I had started off kind of having more like regular like therapy sessions like through the university, because like even if you feel like you're high on adrenaline, you're feeling very excited, and you have like no care in the world, like it eventually, it will catch up when you least expect it to, when your adrenaline comes down and things kind of crash together. So I feel like just having constant check-ins with like professionals, even when you don't believe you need it, is something that I would advise, because like when you need it, it takes time to set up, and at that point you're kind of in a pit by yourself. So like also reaching out to people that might be in years like far above you, so like third or fourth years in this case, because you might like think that you're too far apart to really communicate, but like there's a lot of really strong kind of networks I've built from that as well. So like really reach in your MFA cohort like beyond it as well. Like even I've made a lot of friends, just in like elective classes, where I feel like it's good to not just be in an echo chamber of like other poets, to just kind of like open up your thinking. So like the way you network, I think, is a really important thing.
Well, in theory, a small program should lend itself to having more opportunity for mentorship with faculty. I assume that the faculty to student ratio is pretty good at Cornell. So what's it been like for you building relationships with faculty members?
It's been good. Like I would say that it does take like work. It's not going to just kind of be handed to you. I feel like I kind of had that kind of expectation, but I realized, they kind of see us as adults and as like kind of like colleagues. So like to some degree, like you have to like kind of remember that they're very busy. They're always like, they have their own schedules. So like I've just kind of, constantly been making sure that, if a teacher hasn't replied to me by, a week or like a couple of days, I'll just kind of give like a gentle reminder to kind of like reconfirm a meeting. So like, I think like don't be afraid of just kind of being shameless about reaching out, because that's what you're here for. Right. And I think the professors, when they're there with you, like they're really present, even though they might seem to be kind of very like busy when you're like trying to get a hold of them. But like when they're there, they're really present. So I feel like that to me is the most important thing. And there's a lot of opportunities as well, I think, to kind of have more kind of like informal kind of meetings with them. So it doesn't always have to be like at the office with poems. Like I've had conversations over like lunch or like over like a walk around a lake. And I think that is also an important part, because like you want to know them as a person as well and kind of connect with them as a person, because they're going to be the gateway to like your future kind of opportunities outside the MFA. So it's good to just know them as people and not just as poets.
How has your class experience been? Have you enjoyed the workshops in the program?
We have like a very I guess diverse group of people with kind of like their own philosophies. We have like people who work well in like sound poetry or like eco-poetics. And so like I feel like everyone brings like a very different kind of view to the table. It's every workshop I think will change its dynamics depending on the instructor. So like on my first semester with Volgina, like, she's from a very like a regimented kind of background, like culturally, but also kind of in her own practice. So like she would encourage us, wake up in the morning, start writing immediately until you get hungry, because hunger is a great motivator, like very kind of like, but she like grew up in Belarus, so, it's understandable. And, but I think essentially it's just like take this opportunity to kind of like try and like dive into their philosophy just for that semester, and then to extend like the territory of your practice. And then in another semester, like go with what the other instructor has. So like I've had the one we have now, like Aishan, he's much more kind of much more like free flowing, much more kind of conversational. And that's like a very different type of play with my work as well. And I feel like, yeah, use this opportunity to kind of like sharpen your own thinking and to see where you differ against your teachers.
As I mentioned earlier, Cornell is a fully funded program, meaning each student gets a stipend and tuition remission in exchange for working, in the case of Cornell, as an editorial assistant the first year and as a teaching assistant the second. So tell us about the editorial assistantship at Epic.
So essentially, we kind of meet in the office. Last semester it was twice a week for like 6 hours in total. Now it's kind of, 3 hours in office and 3 hours outside. But I think essentially I would say they're quite flexible as long as you get your quota done. So we just have to read through like a slush pile of submissions and kind of narrow it down over various stages. So it might be like, 500 poetry submissions, and we narrow it down to like the last 10 or 20. And then from that last 10 or 20, we sit down with the guest editor, and then we kind of have a final conversation about which of the last 5 that we want. And so that's just kind of like takes up the whole semester. And I think another kind of side kind of related project to the Epoch assistantship is that we also kind of contribute to the blog. So we might write like a craft essay, or we might interview a visiting writer, and we kind of post it on there. And so that's just kind of like another way of like building your folio. So yeah, I think those are the main responsibilities.
How have you enjoyed that, reading through that slush pile? Have you found that to be beneficial to your own writing?
Yeah, I definitely had to learn to like articulate and like defend certain pieces and why I liked it. So that was really important. And also just kind of being exposed to like a larger range of writing beyond, just very established poets. And because I am able to see, what writing is happening by emerging writers or writers at my kind of age, it kind of helps me kind of like set like a better barometer of like how to read work, because like I think it was very confined to like certain kind of level only. And so now I feel like I have a greater like kind of instinct or like faith in my own instinct to kind of read a work and then decide on the spot, like, does this have potential or not? And I feel like just developing that like belief has been really important for me.
And what about the teaching assistantship? What is the teaching load, and what kinds of classes do students teach?
It's essentially like you teach a first year writing seminar, and that is about like, 3 hours a week in terms of like in class time. Obviously you have to do like outside marking and things like that. And essentially you're teaching like, like writing skills, like basic like composition skills. But my understanding is that it's quite flexible how you kind of frame that approach. So like some of my poet friends, like they would, teach poetry, and they would actually have creative writing assignments for like throughout the semester. And like the composition might be kind of like the exegesis in relation to the poems. And so there's a lot of ways to kind of like tweak the way you teach composition and the way you want to teach writing skills. So like it's you can really turn it into a creative writing workshop to some degree if you wanted to. So I feel like that's quite nice. But there's a really large selection of themes. Like you can teach like health humanities or like short stories or like word and image. And so like they have themes and you kind of like pick your own texts and your own readings that you want to kind of create your own syllabus within that theme.
So you're teaching one class per semester?
Yeah, yeah.
And how much is the stipend that Cornell pays for MFA students?
Believe at the moment I'm getting like close to like 40K a year, and they just increased the next semester's pay by like 8%, because there was like I think there was like a grad school like strike. So I mean like that's always helpful, like to have like the unions around, and they do kind of adjust normally like by 4%, so like an 8% is quite nice. And yeah, I think from all the programs I applied to, like this was quite up there, like quite equivalent to like the other really well-paying ones, like Michigan or Vanderbilt.
And they also include student health insurance at Cornell, right?
Yeah, yeah. You only have to pay for dental and vision, but that's like $200 a year.
And you told me before the interview that there are some lesser known funding and teaching opportunities. Could you tell us about those?
Cornell has this kind of like strong connection with like surrounding like prisons. And so we actually read submissions from them, but we can also like teach in those prisons. And so that kind of gives like, you can do that over the summer, or you can like kind of add that into your existing load. And I think it's somewhere around like, for like 3 months, it might be like $3,000 stipend. And it seems like quite a good experience. And other like opportunities are like you can do you can sign up to be like a reading like assistant for like another professor, and you just kind of take notes on the class. You help kind of mitigate some of the marking loads, and that I think also pays quite well. It could be like up to like $6,000 a semester. There's also like the emergency like student funds at Cornell, so like you can get upwards of like 1,000 over each semester, where it's like if you need help getting like winter coats or like laptop repairs or like toiletries. So like that's another thing that to make a use of. And I think the other one I can think of, the travel grants. So like travel grants, they have travel grants they can apply for every year, like a couple of them. Like the one that you can normally get if you're like a graduate student is like upwards of 1,000. And so you can just kind of like give a project proposal saying like you need to, I think one of my friends wrote that, she wants to go to Mexico to see the widest tree in the world because, she's running like an eco-poetics kind of book. So like that's a really easy way to kind of just go to a quick
trip to Mexico.
Yeah. And it's also like some classes like the Urban Justice Lab, which is what I'm taking at the moment. It's like you essentially just get paid to enroll in that class because like you get money to kind of make an exhibition. And it's quite a large sum of the money. Like I could think like 1,500 I got this semester. And like you don't have to use all of it. You can pocket the rest. And so like there's just classes that have like a extra, they can secure the bag by taking a class,
Yeah. Well, it's good to know and good for anyone who's considering Cornell to keep in mind that there might be ways to make even more on top of that stipend, which is already a strong stipend. And then after you graduate from the program, which is 2 years long, Cornell also offers a lectureship to students. Can you tell us about that lectureship?
Yeah, sure. So it's an optional kind of situation, and even though technically like you still have to apply for it, but essentially like no one has ever not been accepted for it if they want it, and it's just like it's up to 2 years. So what you do is just like you teach just like another like composition kind of class, like kind of like the same as the first year writing seminar, but then you also take another one. You teach another class that's just creative writing. So that's like a really like focused poetry or fiction like workshop that you run. And you just teach those two classes each semester. And that just kind of happens for those 2 years that you're there. And also during those 2 years, you can also still like audit or like take a graded class out of your own interest. Like you have like one free class that you can do each semester, and like some people might use that to kind of, if they want to do like a PhD program and they want like certain training or certain like background, that they might use that time to kind of like pad up the resume or degree. Yeah.
Okay, so essentially the MFA program in which you're taking classes and you're doing the editorial assistantship and the teaching assistantship, that takes 2 years. But then you have the option after you finish for 2 more years to continue teaching those classes, and you still essentially get paid that same stipend.
Yeah, I believe, I'm not sure what the stipend is going to be now, because I've heard some things about it being increased because you're going to be like a lecturer essentially. So like it might, I know it won't be lower than what you have currently, but there's potentially might be higher.
Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word, and this is a question I ask all of my guests. What is one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when applying?
I would say when I came, I was like really like just like nervous about like the amount of rigor that would be in the program, and like whether or not I was kind of, you know, well situated to handle that. I had this idea that, you know, we will all be sitting in like workshops, like, you know, everyone would just kind of be like super intense, like staring at each other across the table, and like, you know, having to kind of like make sure everything I say is like super like smart sounding.
Yeah.
And what I realized is like, you know, it's very like relaxed. It's very, very like it's an environment where I realized, you know, we're all like very much beginners still. Like we're always putting out poems that are, you know, nowhere near finished, but, you know, that's not something that is expected of us, you know, to write poems at like a certain level. And I feel like I realize now that, you know, after coming out, if I wanted to graduate from the MFA program, it's really just like, all I am is just like someone who has produced more work, but it's not that, you know, I've suddenly found the secret of, you know, craft, or I've suddenly understood like how to make the perfect metaphor. It's still very much like the beginning of an apprenticeship, and like the apprenticeship goes on for like, I think like, 40, 50 years, according to some people. So I think I'll write my first poem when I'm 80, maybe.
Well, it's been really awesome talking to you, getting to know you. Thanks for sharing your poetry with us, and thanks for taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. This was super fun. And yeah, it was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you.